Alright guys, so we're going to do a quick little review video of what you need to study for your exam. I'm not going to go through every single problem. I'm going to point out some problems that you need to go through and study. And if you need to come see me and see how to do those problems, you need to do that before your exam time. Part of the reason is for the fact that I still do have a couple of people who haven't finished the mini test and the final test of that last chapter on quadratics that we just did. I'm definitely not going to go through any of those problems. So we'll start back here with the first chapter that we did this year. If I were you and I had a limited amount of time that I wanted to study or was going to study, I would spend a limited amount of time on this test. I would not do a whole lot of studying from this first chapter that we did. Only because a lot of the things that you see in this first chapter we have been doing all throughout the year, so you're not going to need to go through and review a lot of it because we've been doing it all along. But I will highlight a couple of things. Number one, make sure you understand how to plug in numbers. When you evaluate something, remember that means to find a value. So make sure that you can plug in numbers and plug it into the calculator and find an answer. Big key things like with number 8, making sure you understand the order of operations. Be careful, don't try to type too much into the calculator at one time, but make sure you understand how to go through and use the order of operations. The calculator is pretty smart. It'll do the order of operations a lot for you, but do not think that you can just type everything in from this huge fraction like number 8 here. So again, just make sure you know how to do some basic evaluation skills, plugging in numbers and finding answers. Don't worry about these particular problems here. Yes, it is important to be able to put numbers in order, but no, there's not going to be a specific problem on the exam that tells you to do that. Number 13, number 14 encompasses some skills of dividing. Remember, these are very similar to the distributive property, like you see down here below those. So those are pretty important skills. You may not see specific questions from these, but you definitely need to know how to divide negative 14 by 7 and get negative 2x, divide 42 by 7 and get 6. But here's the big key and the big thing that a lot of people messed up on this particular section. There is no equal sign right here. Do not try to solve. That was one of those big things that I talked about near the beginning of the year, knowing the difference between the word evaluate, simplify, which is actually what you're doing here, and solve. Make sure that you understand the difference between those words and what you're supposed to do. So this one just tells me to divide. Make sure you divide. When you are asked to simplify, like you see here in these problems down here, make sure that when you simplify, you don't go too far. If you do negative 8 times x, it's negative 8x. Negative 8 times negative 5, that's positive 40. But don't keep going. There's nothing else to do there. There's nothing else to solve. You can't collect these like terms because they're not like terms. Same thing down here when you add like terms together. Looking back on this test, you guys are probably wishing everything that we did was still this test, but that is not the case. Especially when you look at a question like number 20. You'd be surprised. I actually had some people miss this one. I wasn't trying to confuse anybody. I was trying to remind people that when you collect like terms, you still have the variable there. Just like 10 oranges minus 6 oranges would be 4 oranges. So a lot of people messed up and dropped off variables and things in the other ones. So if I was focusing my efforts on this first chapter test, I would really focus it here in this section where you're solving equations. Again, knowing that word solve is critical. So, just as a quick little review, what does the word solve mean? It means to isolate the variable. Or the way we say it a lot of times, get x by itself, right? Well, make sure that you get the x by itself using opposite operations, and that's a big key. When you look at one like number 23, when you want to move this 3x over here to get the x's together, you have to add 3x because it's a negative. So 3x and 3x would be 6x. Then if you want to move this 8 over here, you add 8. Make sure you're doing the opposite thing. But the key thing that you'll notice is that it's the number one rule when you're solving equations is what you do to one side, you got to do to the other. And that's a critical piece when you are solving equations. So this one, you get 6x equals 12. You divide by 6 on both sides, and you get x is equal to 2. Remember, you can always take this answer and plug it back in up here and see if it works. So that's a good thing about solving these equations, especially in this first chapter when you've just got an x to the first power. You don't have to overthink it too much. You didn't have a whole lot of real-life applications. We did a few, so you didn't have to worry about negative numbers being weird sometimes and okay at other times. So when you are looking at solving these equations, you can always plug in your number and see if it works. What that means with a multiple choice exam is that yes, if the answer is there, you can do some plugging in and seeing if things work. Just realize that I also have put answers there that are intentionally confusing, and I've put answers there for the most common mistakes that people make. Not because I want to be a jerk, but because I want you to actually know what you're doing and know that your answer is correct. I don't want it to be just a random guess and check. So, ones that might give you the most issues here and you definitely want to spend some time with would be the ones like number 25, 26 when you have those fractions. Remember, I gave you a way to solve these just like normal. You could take and do subtract 2/3 on both sides, and then you could get the 1/4 out here, and the 1/3 minus 2/3 would be negative 1/3, and then multiply by 4. You could do that. Or there was another way I gave you to solve these, and that was using the common denominator for all the fractions. Now, what's the common denominator with 3 and 4? The number that both of them divide into would be 12. If you multiply this thing by 12, distributive property again, 12 times 2/3, you would end up with 8. 12 times 1/4 would be 3y. 12 times 1/3 would be 4. Now, if you can't do that in your head, what do? You use a calculator. That's okay. Then it gives me an equation, though, that doesn't have fractions anymore. And I can subtract 8, 3y is negative 4, divide by 3 on both sides, and I got y is equal to negative 4/3. Done. Problem over. Okay? And you can do the same thing on this one. Even though this one's ridiculously ugly, you could solve it like normal by adding the 1/2 x over here to the 3/4, adding the 1/7 to the 2/3. You're going to have to use a calculator, but you can do that. You can solve it just like normal. Or you can take this thing right here and you can multiply by the common denominator. Now, I showed you a process, and I'm not going to go through and do this process very slowly, but I showed you a process of taking the denominators 2, 3, 4, and 7. Yes, I put them in order. Factoring those denominators, this will be 1 times 2, prime number, 1 times 3, prime number, 1 times 7, prime number. But then 4, we talked about those little factor trees, and this will be 1 times 4, which splits up into 2 times 2, or 1 times 2 times 2, which is 1 times 2 squared. And I told you to take your numbers here that you look at, cover up these guys here, and just look at these factors. You got 1s, you got a couple 2s, you got a 3, and you got a 7. List those numbers out. Then, if any of them have exponents, notice this one is 2 squared, and this one is 2 to the first. Only keep the highest exponent and multiply those together, and you've got your common denominator. This will be 1 times 4, which is 4, 4 times 3, which is 12, 12 times 7, which is going to be 84. That's your least common denominator. And if you multiply 84 times all of those, it'll do the same thing that we got over here. It'll cancel out my fractions for me. So, what you would end up with here is you'd end up with 63x, because you do 84 times 3 over 4. Then you do 84 times negative 1 over 7. That would be negative 12. And then you do 84 times 2 over 3. And that's going to be 56. And then 84 times negative 1 over 2, or 1/2, is 42. Then you've got this equation that you just solve like normal. Add the 42 and get 105x. Again, I'm doing this very quickly just because it's been a while we've been using these skills. Add the 12 over here, you get 68. Divide by 105 and you get 68 over 105. Yes, approximately as a decimal, I think that's like 0.65 or somewhere around there. Because as you look back through your old tests and you see, -1, -2, there's probably something very small wrong. So if you wonder why you got something wrong, I can let you know. If you just put the answer down, sometimes you'll miss a point. If you forgot something small, even if you got the answer right, you might have got something small like putting an approximation symbol with a decimal, and you didn't do that. That would mess up your problem. So just be aware of that. That might be a reason I subtracted a point. Make sure if you have any questions, you can ask me, and I'll look back at it. But more than likely, it's just something little, usually when it's a point. It could be a plus or minus sign. If you miss and you don't do any of the work, there's a possibility that I might have subtracted a point because you didn't do any work at all when you were doing your solving. So that's a possibility. Alright, so then on the next page of this test, you'll see several different equations here. Solving for y, getting y by itself. Essential skill, but maybe not a particular question that you have to study. You'll also see some inequalities. Remember, solving inequalities is the same thing as solving an equation. The only thing that you would have to watch out for is one like number 30 here. You make sure if you subtract 3 here, that you subtract 3 here, subtract 3 here. That would give me 0. And then 20. Then you also had to remember if you divide by a negative, what are you supposed to do with an inequality? You flip the symbol around. And many of you, that got you on this particular problem. You forgot to flip the symbol around. And if you forget to flip the symbol around, that's going to mess up your graph. Now, when it comes to graphing on the exam, just as a quick reminder, it's a multiple choice exam. So when I'm testing you on graphing, I'm not going to be able to have you actually graph it. You'll just have to be able to pick out the graph from options that you see. So be aware that that is a possibility, that you might see a graph that you have to pick the answer. But with inequalities, pretty much the same technique of solving with equations. You just have to make sure you watch out for things like this one where you have 3 parts instead of just 2 sides. And then you have to watch out when you divide by a negative. You got to flip that symbol around. With the absolute values, if you do not remember how to solve these, I wouldn't spend a ton of my time there. This may be where I would use good test-taking skills at going through and just plugging in the answers and seeing if they work. But if you have some time to solve, practice solving, or you remember how to solve, if it's a less than with an absolute value, remember it always ends up looking like that last inequality we just did. It goes in between the two, negative and positive. Here's why. If you think about a number line, if you got negative 47 and positive 47, zeros in the middle, this is 47 spaces away. This is 47 spaces away from 0. What does absolute value mean? The distance from 0. So if it says the distance is less than or equal to, that means it has to be somewhere in between here, because those are the distances that are smaller. So I literally plug it in between. So that number inside the absolute value has to be between negative 47 and positive 47. Then I solve that just like I normally do, like I did on the last problem I showed you. When it's greater than or equal to, remember that means the distance is bigger than 15. So one of the things will be greater than or equal to 15, because that means if you go way past 15 on the number line, or the other one, and this is the one most people miss, this is probably the one you missed when you took this test, is less than negative 15. This one always gets people right here, because in your brain you're saying less, that's no way, that says greater. But remember what it's saying is, it's saying the distance. That's what absolute value means. The distance is greater, so the numbers would actually be smaller. Because if you go past negative 15, The numbers are getting tiny, but the distance is actually big. The last type, and again, then you would solve from here. The last type would be an equation, and this one is usually the easiest one for most people. You set 1 equal to positive 23, and you set 1 equal to negative 23. Because if you have a distance that is 23 spaces, that's the only two spots on the number line that are 23 spaces from 0. Then you solve those just like normal. The last thing that you saw on this test was just a little bit of things with multiple variables there and some word problems. Definitely a good idea to go through and look at how to solve some of those, but most of your word problems will come from the later tests that we'll look at. Alright, so let's transition to chapter number 2. In chapter number 2, this is the chapter where we started talking about linear versus not linear. And one of the first things that we learned how to do was to test and see if something was linear or not. That's a pretty important skill to have, so you can guess that I'm probably going to put some of these types of questions on there. Maybe not 6 of them, but make sure that you understand how to tell if something's linear. Remember, linear equations have the variable raised to the first power, and there are no variables inside a absolute value. There's no variables inside a radical. There's no variables inside the denominator of a fraction. So that's why on this one here, if you look, this one and this one are the only ones that are linear, because they have x's and y's raised to the first power, and they do not have an x or a y in an absolute value, a radical, or the denominator of a fraction. This one obviously is quadratic. This one's obviously absolute value, so you should know the difference, that those are not a line. They actually have a very similar type of shape to them, absolute value being a V shape and a quadratic being a U shape, right? But they're both symmetric, and so they both had some similarities between each other. We haven't looked at what a radical looks like, but we will later in the year. And we haven't looked at this one. This one's actually called a rational function because the x is in the denominator. If you plugged in -4 right here, it would cause 0 on the bottom, and that you can't do. And so what you would have is you have a weird graph with some weird things happening. So make sure you understand how to tell if something's linear or not. Then you need to be able to tell if something's a function. Remember, each input only has one output in a function. So number 8 is a function, number 7 is not. Each input has more than one output here. You need to be able to deal with finding the x-intercept and the y-intercept to find graphs. But, like I said, it'll be mainly matching when it comes to that. Speaking of that, if you look at this test, you go down to number 20. This is a nice little helpful hint. What is the exam? It's multiple choice. What did Mr. Harrison tell you to study for your exam? Your old tests. What are we looking at right now? Your old test. What's on the screen right now? Multiple choice from your old tests. I'll leave you to think about what that means. Okay. So if you go down through here, there's some great multiple choice examples. Number 23 is a good example of what I mean by matching up a graph. Here you have the graph and you have to match up your equation. If you know how to do your x-intercept and your y-intercept on this one, it would be really helpful because your x-intercept's at -5 and your y-intercept's at 3. And so that gives you C being the correct solution here, because x-intercept would be -5 and your y-intercept would be +3, excuse me. So that's what I mean by matching up when you're looking at your multiple choice graphing. And there's a bunch of them on this test. 20 down through 28, you had multiple choice questions. Okay, so I definitely would spend a lot of time there. The other thing that you need to make sure that you know how to do, definitely important to find the slope. Notice that there's a practice one down here in the multiple choice of finding the slope on number 22. Remember the slope formula. I'm not going to go through and review that a lot here, but that y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And then when you get your answer, don't forget that you're going to end up with something like 14 over 4. That's not in my answers. Be able to reduce your fractions. If you can't reduce them in your head, then use your calculator and reduce your fractions that way. So make sure you know how to find the slope. Make sure you also know how to find the equation of a line. Remember, when you're finding the equation of a line, like in number 15 here, number 16 when you were doing a scatter plot, number 17, you've got to find your M and your B. Okay? That means you've got to find your slope and you've got to find your y-intercept. So if you look down here, like your multiple choice practice problems, like number 25 here, what's the equation of the line? You first find your slope. You do 7 minus -1 over 0 minus -4. That gives me 8 over 4, which is 2. Now notice, if I can find my slope, I can immediately eliminate this one, and this one as answer choices. So I've immediately given myself a better chance just by knowing how to find the slope. I went from a 20% chance of guessing it right to now I got a 50-50 shot of guessing it right. And if I know a little bit more information about my y-intercept, my b, I realize this is the y-intercept, 7. So the answer is C. Or I use my slope, and one of these points, remember I gave you a form that was called point slope form. When do you use point slope form? When you have a point and a, you got it, slope. Like if you plug in y minus 7, your y value, 2 is your slope, x minus 0 is your x value. Well, x minus 0 is just x, so this is 2 times x. And then what do I do with the minus 7? Add it here, that's going to be 2x plus 7. Either way, I get this as my correct answer. So the more you know, the better it's going to be for you. Same thing with like number 26. It says it's perpendicular to this line. What does perpendicular mean? That means the slope is opposite and reciprocal. So what's the opposite of -2? Positive. What's the reciprocal? 1/2. So it'd be positive 1/2 is the opposite and reciprocal of this slope. So look at your answer choices. This is wrong, right? This is wrong. Again, just by knowing how to find slope, you were able to narrow your answers down. So that's a good test-taking skill as you go through and you get ready for your exam. Make sure you just think about that. And as you go through your exam, and you actually take your exam, really think about eliminating answers if you can. Okay? So, the last thing on this chapter was those absolute values. We threw those in because they're similar in some respects, because they're two lines that make up a V shape. But remember, when we got into the quadratics, we actually got into a little bit more detail with this because they're very similar to the vertex form of a quadratic. When you're dealing with a absolute value, you have the same kind of form where you do the opposite same technique, and that's my vertex. So that's my vertex of my V shape, just like it is when we're talking about a quadratic that has a U shape. And then you can find the rest of this graph by using the table of values to plug in some other points. You know both sides are symmetric, and you know both sides make a straight line on this one, so that helps this one be a little bit easier than quadratics, but it's the same concept when you're dealing with these. So make sure that you take a little look at those. Alright, so the last one that I'm going to go through in a little detail is your Chapter 3, your test on systems of equations. And then I'm going to go through briefly and just point out some things you study about quadratics. I'm not going to go through quadratics because, again, I have several people who still haven't finished the test. That means come back and finish it quickly. Alright, so in the third chapter of the year, we talked about systems of equations. Remember, systems of equations, we were looking at two equations and trying to find the solution that works for both of them, not just one of the equations. So one of the methods that we learned was the graphing method. You won't be able to go through and deal with actually graphing, but you should be able to match it up and see that if you have two lines, where they cross each other would be the solution, because that's the only point that works for both lines. If they were parallel lines, that means there's no solution, right? And if they ended up being the same line, you had two lines right on top of each other, then that would be infinite solutions. Okay. Now, we also learned a couple of other ways to solve these that are a little bit more efficient than graphing. One of those was called the substitution method, and the other one was called the addition method. I'm just going to briefly point out some things about both of those. First of all, the substitution method, remember you pick one of the equations and you solve it. So like the second equation here, if I add 2y and add 2y, that gives me x equals 3 plus 2y. That is equal to x. So we can take that and we can plug it into x in the other equation. And that's the absolutely critical step when you are solving using the substitution method, is you have to plug it in to the other equation. Because then what I have is I have an equation that only has the other variable, y's, in it. So now I can solve this equation just like I talked about on chapter 1 just a little while ago. I am not going to do that here because you should be able to solve and get y. But then once you get y, you plug it in to here to find x. Now this one in particular right here actually has infinite solutions, because when you solve this you're going to distribute the 2, you're going to get 6 plus 4y. You're going to notice on this one that your y's cancel out. So that means there's no y's there, and it's 6 equals 6, which is true. That is infinite solutions. That means these two lines are actually the same line. The other method was called the addition method. Remember, with the addition method, you didn't have to do this. You didn't have to pick a variable to solve for. You had to pick a variable to cancel out. Meaning, when I'm looking at this, I decide to cancel my x's. I have to get opposites. I multiply -3 times this one. So the first one stays the same. -3 times x is -3x. -3 times -y is +3y. And -3 times 3 is -9. That gives me here 0 cancels out. 0 cancels out. So there's nothing here. -16 and -9 is going to be -24. Oh goodness, why am I doing 16, you guys? See, my teacher mistake here. -6 and -9 is -15. Either way, this one has 0 equals -15, which is no solution, because that means the x's and y's cancel out, but there's nothing true here. No solution. Now that doesn't always happen that you get these two answers. I just had these in particular on this test. Usually you have some type of answer that you get. So if you take a look at something like, let's move down here and let's do a little word problem. Practice real quick. Bryce goes out to buy art supplies. He buys 4 sketch pads and 2 palettes for $14. Following week at the same prices, he buys 3 sketch pads, 6 palettes, and pays $24. X is the price of sketch pads. Y is the price of palettes. Find the price for the 2 items. I made some emphasis there on price because some of you missed it because of that. But 4 sketch pads means 4 times X, because we don't know what the price is. 2 palettes is 2 times Y, because we don't know what the price is. But if you add the prices together, it should be $14. Then, following week, he buys 3 and 6 for $24. Now, I had a lot of you, even those of you that claim you're not real good at dealing with word problems, had a lot of you get this equations right, but you didn't go through and solve it correctly. Or, you got all the solving right, you forgot to tell me what the price was. You just gave me numbers. Yes, I'm picky when it comes to that, because this is real world. You got to make sure that it actually you answer it in a real world fashion. So this one would be a great example where, if you look at the y's, they would be easy to cancel out if you multiply the first equation by -3. Why did I multiply it by -3? Well, it gives me -12x, but that's not y. -3 times 2 is -6y. That will now cancel out with my y value here. So that's why I multiplied it by negative 3. Negative 3 times 14 is negative 42. That's the other mistake that a lot of people made. They forgot to multiply the number times everything in the equation. What you do to one side, you got to do to the other, so don't forget to do that. What is 3x and negative 12x? That's negative 9x. The 6y and negative 6y cancel. What's 24 and negative 42? Negative 18. Then all you had to do was divide by negative 9, and x is equal to 2. Then you take that answer and you plug it back in. So you take this answer, I don't care where you plug it. I personally would probably plug it into the first one up here and do 4 times 2 plus 2y equals 14. 4 times 2 is 8. If I subtract 8, that's going to give me 6 divided by 2. I get y is equal to 3. But you had to tell me your answer, guys. You had to tell me that it was $2 for what? The sketch pads. And there are some questions with this particular chapter on the exam, where if you don't pay attention to that, you're going to miss the question. The numbers are right in the problem, but you don't pay attention to what units it should be or what it's talking about, you'll miss the question. And that's why some of you missed this one. Questions? Oh yeah, I'm not there. I can't answer them. Seriously, guys, if you have any questions on these, please come back and ask me if you got any questions, okay? So, last thing I want to point out on this chapter is starting down here at number 11, there's a whole section of multiple choice items. My exam is multiple choice. Mr. Harrison told me the best thing to study for my exam is my old tests. These are my old tests, and they have multiple choice on them. I wonder if I should study them. Okay. Anyways. On the 3 variable systems, again, this is multiple choice, so you may not want to spend a whole lot of time going back through and reviewing how to solve a 3 variable system. I'm not going to actually do one here now, but remember it was based off the addition method, meaning if you had equation number 1 here and equation number 3 here, the z's would cancel. So you do x and 2x is 3x, 5y and 4y is 9y. The z's cancel, and 16 and 20 is 36. And so it gives me an equation that has x and y. So then all I got to do is cancel out z again with a different pair. Can't use 1 and 3 this time, but I could use 1 and 2. Or I could use 2 and 3, cancel out z again, and it gives me x and y. And then I just treat it just like I did that problem a minute ago with the sketch pads and the palettes. So again, I wouldn't spend a ton of time here studying unless you just have the extra time to do so. This is one of those where it would be very helpful to use good test taking skills and finding, plugging in, see if something works. Now in the real world, in a job type situation, if you ever run across one of those, it definitely will save you a lot of time and a headache if you can actually just solve it. But here for an exam review, I'm not going to spend that extra time. So that would be your systems of equations test. Big key that I would focus in on if I had no time at all to study, just very little time to go after this chapter, I would study the addition method. The addition method is critical to this chapter. Alright, so the last 2 tests that we had here was the mini test and the major test from Quadratics. You'll notice that both of them start off very similar. Talking about those forms, you need to know those 3 forms. Make sure that you know how to find a vertex for a parabola. You get the whole entire graph. Make sure that you know how to factor. Very important skill. Make sure that you know how to deal with an area problem, the area of a border. There's some other videos on YouTube you can watch of mine for these. Not going to go through those here just because, again, people haven't finished these. Know the Pythagorean theorem and a revenue problem. And then how to simplify some radicals. That was the mini test. The major test starts off very similar. Knowing those 3 forms, standard, vertex, and intercept, right? And that wasn't in the right order, by the way. So just in case you were trying to go through and get some cheap answers there. Now know how to go through and deal with a square root of a negative. Sorry, skipped over that. Make sure, again, you saw some factoring here, some graphing. Make sure you know how to solve a quadratic. Remember, we solved them by factoring, by completing the square. And then we had things like this one, number 16, where you could just use just a square root. And then on the other ones, you could have used any method you wanted, but quadratic formula is a good one. X equals negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Yes, I'm singing while I'm making a video. It's great, huh? Know how to work with some imaginary number stuff. Not much, but just a little bit. Again, there was another revenue problem. There was another border problem dealing with area. And there's a few multiple choice on this test too. A few multiple choice that you can kind of go back and look at and think about, oh yeah, got to study multiple choice for my exam. Okay. So that would be what I would review, the things that I would focus on for my exam. So you also have a review sheet that I gave you. You have time to come ask me questions next week. You guys study hard. Sorry I wasn't at school today. Have a great day.